The courtroom burst into laughter the second Richard Vane leaned back in his chair and said it. "Then sue me." He said it casually, like he was ordering lunch. Like the frail man standing across from him wasn't even human. The laughter didn't come from everyone. Mostly from the people sitting behind Richard. 3 expensive lawyers, a young assistant typing notes on a tablet, and a woman in pearls who looked embarrassed to even be in the same room as the plaintiff. But the old man standing at the plaintiff's table didn't laugh. He just tightened his grip on the cane in his trembling hand. The camera zoomed closer. His suit was wrinkled. One sleeve was slightly burned near the wrist. His gray beard looked uneven, like he'd trimmed it himself in a gas station bathroom, and pinned to the left side of his coat was a small bronze military insignia. Judge Judy noticed it immediately. "So," she said sharply, peering over her glasses, "you think this is funny?" Richard smirked. "I think this is ridiculous. You're being sued for illegally towing a disabled veteran's vehicle and destroying everything inside it. It was abandoned property." The old man finally spoke. "My wife's ashes were in that truck." The courtroom went silent. Even Richard's assistant stopped typing. Judge Judy slowly turned toward the plaintiff. "What did you just say?" The old veteran swallowed hard. "My wife passed 8 months ago," he said quietly. "I kept her ashes in the glove compartment because she always loved road trips. I wasn't done saying goodbye to her yet." The silence became suffocating. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, Richard Vane stopped smiling. But what happened next would completely change the case, because Judge Judy was about to discover this wasn't just a dispute over a towed truck. It was something far uglier and far more personal. "State your name." "Walter Brooks." "How old are you, Mr. Brooks?" 72. "And you served in the military?" "Yes, Mom, Marine Corps, Vietnam." Judge Judy nodded once. "Defendant?" Richard adjusted his cufflinks before answering. "Richard Vane, CEO of Vane Urban Development." Judge Judy recognized the name immediately. Everybody did. Richard Vane was one of those men constantly featured in business magazines, beside headlines about luxury high-rises and billion-dollar expansion projects. His company specialized in buying old neighborhoods, demolishing them, and replacing them with expensive apartment towers. To some people, he was a visionary. To others, he was a parasite. Judge Judy flipped through the case file. "Mr. Brooks is suing you for $11,000. And emotional damages," Walter added softly. Richard rolled his eyes. Judge Judy caught it instantly. "You roll your eyes again in my courtroom, sir. I'll remove you myself." The audience murmured. Richard straightened up. Walter took a shaky breath. "My truck broke down near one of his construction sites in Newark. Transmission died. I was waiting for a veteran's assistance tow service." "How long was the vehicle there?" "Maybe 4 hours. Richard immediately jumped in. It was blocking access to private property." Walter turned toward him. "It was snowing. And I told your security guard I was waiting for help." Richard shrugged. "We have protocols." Judge Judy frowned. "You had the vehicle towed after 4 hours during a snowstorm? It was illegally parked." Walter's voice cracked. "I had nowhere else to go." That line hit harder than anyone expected. Judge Judy looked up slowly. "What do you mean by that?" Walter hesitated. Then he quietly answered, "I was living in the truck." A murmur spread across the courtroom. Richard looked annoyed now, not sympathetic. Judge Judy narrowed her eyes. "You're homeless?" Walter nodded once. "My rent went up after his company bought the building." Now every eye in the courtroom shifted back toward Richard. He leaned forward immediately. "That has nothing to do with me personally." Walter stared at him. "You bought the whole block. That's called business. You raised everybody's rent. That's called market value. You threw us out." Richard snapped back instantly. "I renovated a dump." Walter's face tightened. "It was our home." The tension exploded across the room. Judge Judy slammed her pen down. Enough. Nobody moved. She turned back toward Walter. "What happened after the truck was towed?" Walter swallowed. I went to the impound yard the next morning. And? They said I owed $2,300. Judge Judy blinked. For what? Towing fees, overnight storage, hazard processing. Richard calmly crossed his arms. Standard charges. Judge Judy looked disgusted. On a broken-down pickup truck. Walter reached into his worn coat and pulled out folded paperwork. His hands shook while passing it to the bailiff. Judge Judy examined the documents. Then her expression changed. What is this? Walter looked down. They crushed it. The courtroom erupted. They what? Judge Judy barked. Richard immediately raised a hand. It was processed according to company policy after no retrieval. It was there one day. 26 hours. Walter's voice cracked again. My medication was in there. Judge Judy's face hardened. My uniforms. He paused. My wife's ashes. Even the audience looked horrified now, but Richard Vane still looked irritated more than remorseful. Then he made the biggest mistake of the entire case. He sighed loudly and muttered, "It's not like she cared." The courtroom exploded. People gasped. One woman in the audience literally covered her mouth. Walter froze like he'd been punched. And Judge Judy went completely still. That was always the dangerous moment. Not when she yelled, when she got quiet. "Excuse me?" she asked. Richard realized too late what he'd said. "I meant, emotionally speaking." No, we heard what you meant." Walter looked down at the table, gripping his cane so tightly his knuckles turned white. Judge Judy stared directly at Richard. "You destroyed a dead woman's remains. And your response is sarcasm?" Richard's lawyer finally stepped in. "Your Honor, my client apologizes if the statement came across. It came across exactly the way he intended." Walter suddenly spoke again, very softly. "She was all I had left, and somehow, that hurt more than anything else." The next 20 minutes unraveled Richard Vane's image piece by piece. Walter explained that after returning from Vietnam, he worked 30 years as a city bus mechanic, never arrested, never sued anyone, never asked for help. He met his wife Clara at a diner in 1979. "She hated me at first," he said with the faintest smile. Judge Judy leaned back slightly. "Why?" Walter almost laughed. "She caught me staring at her." A few people chuckled. "She dumped coffee on my boots." The room softened for the first time. "We were married 41 years. Then the smile disappeared again. She got cancer."
Walter's voice began trembling harder now. "I sold everything for treatments."
Richard glanced at his watch. Judge Judy noticed immediately.
"Am I delaying something important, Mr. Vane?"
"No, you seem impatient. I just don't understand why my company is responsible for his personal life." Walter looked toward him slowly. "You destroyed the last thing I had." Richard fired back instantly. "It was a rusty truck." Walter slammed his cane against the floor. "It was my home!" The crack echoed through the courtroom. Even Judge Judy looked startled. Walter's eyes filled with tears he clearly hated showing. "I slept in that truck for 7 months. His breathing became shaky. I ate canned soup in that truck." He pointed at Richard. "My wife died in that truck." Silence, total silence. Walter wiped his face angrily. "I held her hand while she stopped breathing. Nobody moved. Even Richard's lawyer looked uncomfortable now." Walter continued. "You know what she said before she died?" Judge Judy quietly shook her head. "She said, 'Don't let them make you disappear.'" Richard shifted uncomfortably. Walter stared directly at him. "But that's what people like you do." The entire courtroom felt heavier now, not because of the money, because everybody suddenly understood the real lawsuit. Walter Brooks wasn't suing over a truck. He was suing because the world had stopped seeing him as a person, and Richard Vane represented every door that had closed in his face. But then, Judge Judy found something inside the file that changed everything again. She held up a printed photograph. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "is this your vehicle?" Walter nodded. The photo showed his old pickup truck buried in snow beside a construction fence. Judge Judy squinted. "Wait a minute." She brought the photo closer. Then she looked toward Richard. You said this vehicle was blocking access. It was. Judge Judy tapped the image. There's nearly 12 feet of clearance. Richard's lawyer leaned forward. There were safety concerns. Judge Judy ignored him. Then she noticed something else. A bright orange notice sticker on the windshield tight-framed it. She narrowed her eyes. This ticket says 9:12 p.m. Walter immediately looked confused. That can't be right. Why not? Because I talked to the security guard after 10. Judge Judy slowly lowered the photo. Now the courtroom shifted again. Richard's lawyer sensed danger immediately. There may be a clerical error. Judge Judy stared directly at him. Oh, I don't think so. She turned toward Walter. You're telling me your truck was ticketed before anyone even spoke to you? Walter nodded slowly. Judge Judy looked back at Richard. You had that vehicle marked for towing before determining whether the owner was stranded. Richard crossed his arms. We had repeated trespassing problems. And disabled veterans are now trespassers? Richard exhaled sharply. This is emotional manipulation. Judge Judy leaned forward. No, this is called humanity. The audience applauded softly. Stop clapping, she snapped instantly. The applause died immediately. But the damage to Richard's image was already done. Then came the witness nobody expected. A construction worker named Miguel Herrera. Richard's lawyer objected immediately. Relevance? Judge Judy answered before Walter could. I'll decide relevance. Miguel walked to the stand nervously. Unlike Richard's polished appearance, Miguel looked exhausted. Concrete dust still stained his boots. Do you work for Vane Urban Development? Yes. How long? 6 years. Judge Judy nodded. What do you know about this case? Miguel hesitated, then looked directly at Richard, and fear crossed his face. That alone told Judge Judy something important. Sir, she said firmly, you are protected in this courtroom. Speak. Miguel swallowed. The old man wasn't blocking anything. Richard's lawyer stood immediately. Objection. Sit down, Miguel continued. The security guard told management the guy was homeless. Walter lowered his eyes. Miguel's jaw tightened. And then one of the supervisors said. He hesitated again. Judge Judy waited. What did they say? Miguel took a breath. Get rid of him before investors arrive tomorrow. The courtroom exploded again. Richard immediately stood up. That is a lie. Miguel pointed directly at him. You were there. Richard froze. Miguel continued. You said homeless people were bad for property value. Richard's face darkened. This disgruntled employee was fired 2 weeks ago. Miguel fired back instantly. Because I reported wage theft. Now the courtroom was spinning in 3 different directions at once. Judge Judy raised both hands. One person at a time. Walter sat frozen, stunned by everything unfolding around him. Judge Judy looked toward Richard again. Did you say that? No. Miguel laughed bitterly. You don't even remember us. Judge Judy caught that line instantly. What does that mean? Miguel looked toward the floor. There were lots of people removed from those buildings. Richard rubbed his forehead. Urban redevelopment requires relocation. Walter muttered quietly. You mean eviction? Richard ignored him. Miguel continued. There was an old lady crying in the hallway one night because she couldn't afford the new rent. Judge Judy frowned. What happened? Miguel answered softly. Mr. Vane told security to carry her furniture outside. The audience groaned. Richard snapped. This is becoming political. Judge Judy shot back instantly. No, this is becoming revealing. Then she asked the question nobody expected. Mr. Vane, did you ever serve in the military? Richard blinked. What? Simple question. No. Anyone in your family? No. Judge Judy nodded slowly. Then perhaps that explains why you failed to understand something very basic. Richard looked irritated. Judge Judy's voice sharpened. Men like Walter Brooks protected this country while people like you learned how to profit from it. Dead silence. Richard opened his mouth. But Judge Judy wasn't done. You see an inconvenience. I see a man who came home from war and got discarded by the very society he served." Walter looked down, overwhelmed. And for the first time, Richard Vane looked nervous. But the biggest twist still hadn't happened yet. Because sitting quietly in the back row was a woman nobody had noticed, until she suddenly stood up crying. "Please stop." The entire courtroom turned. A woman in her 30s stepped forward trembling. Judge Judy frowned. "And who are you?" The woman wiped tears from her face. "My name is Emily Vane." Richard's face lost all color. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. "Your daughter?" Richard stood instantly. "You don't need to do this." But Emily ignored him. Then she looked directly at Walter Brooks. And what she said next shattered the entire courtroom. "I know who your wife was." Walter froze. "What?" Emily nodded through tears. "Clara Brooks." Walter looked like he couldn't breathe. "How do you know that name?" Emily's voice cracked. "She saved my life." Complete silence. Richard whispered harshly, "Emily," but she kept going. 12 years ago I overdosed in a diner bathroom." Walter's eyes widened. Emily wiped her tears. "I was 17. She looked down. My father was never around. My mother had just died. I was using pills." Richard looked humiliated now. Emily pointed toward Walter. "Your wife found me unconscious." Walter slowly sat back down. Emily continued crying. "She stayed with me in the hospital for 2 days because my father never came." The courtroom became painfully quiet. Walter whispered, "Clara never told me that." Emily nodded. "She said she didn't want praise. She just said, sometimes people need someone to sit beside them." Judge Judy removed her glasses slowly. Even she looked emotional now. Emily turned toward her father. "And you destroyed her ashes." Richard looked trapped for the first time in his life. "Emily, this is not the place." "No," she snapped. "This is exactly the place." She pointed at him. "You keep pretending everything is business." Richard's face hardened again. "You have no idea what it took to build my company. And you have no idea what it costs other people." Walter sat motionless, almost in shock. Emily looked toward him again. "I tried finding you after Clara died." Walter whispered. "You knew she passed?" Emily nodded. "I attended the funeral in the back without speaking to anyone." Walter's eyes filled instantly. "She talked about you," he whispered. Emily broke down crying. "She was the only adult who ever made me feel safe." Even the audience was emotional now. Richard looked completely cornered. Then Judge Judy asked quietly, "Mr. Vane, did you know any of this?" He didn't answer. Which was answer enough. Emily stared at him in disbelief. "You crushed the truck without even checking what was inside." Richard snapped back defensively. "There are thousands of vehicles processed every year, and human beings inside every one of them." That line hit like a bomb. Judge Judy leaned back slowly, because now this case wasn't about negligence anymore. It was about indifference, and everybody in the room could feel it. Richard's lawyer tried desperately to recover. "Your Honor, while emotional testimony is unfortunate, the legal issue remains limited to property damages." Judge Judy turned toward him sharply. "You're right." The lawyer looked relieved, then Judge Judy continued, "But sometimes property reveals character." The courtroom murmured again. Judge Judy looked through the paperwork carefully, then she paused. "What is this?" Richard's lawyer stiffened. Judge Judy held up another document. "A tax write-off?" Richard's expression changed instantly. Judge Judy read aloud, "Demolition clearance expenses related to transient encampment removal." Walter frowned. "Transient?" Judge Judy looked furious now. "You categorized this veteran's belongings as urban waste." Richard's lawyer intervened quickly. "That's accounting language." Judge Judy slammed the paper down. "No, that's dehumanization." Richard finally lost his temper. "Oh, come on!" The room froze. He stood up fully now. "This entire hearing is turning me into some kind of villain because one man couldn't maintain his life." Walter lowered his head. Richard kept going. "I'm not responsible for every poor decision people make." Emily stared at him in horror. Judge Judy's expression became ice cold. "Sit down." But Richard ignored her. You know how many jobs my company creates? Sit down. You know how much tax revenue? Bailiff. The bailiff immediately stepped forward. Richard finally sat, breathing hard. Judge Judy stared at him for several long seconds. Then she quietly asked, "Do you know what your problem is, Mr. Vane?" Richard said nothing. "You think money replaces decency." Silence. "You believe success excuses cruelty." Richard looked away. Judge Judy continued, "And the saddest part is, I don't think anyone's ever told you no before." That landed hard, especially because everybody knew it was true. Then Walter unexpectedly stood up again, slowly, painfully. Using his cane, Judge Judy looked concerned. "Mr. Brooks?" Walter turned toward Richard, and his voice was calm now, almost tired. "I didn't come here because I thought I'd win." Richard frowned. Walter nodded toward Emily. "I came because my wife believed people could still change." Emily began crying again. Walter continued. "She spent her whole life helping strangers." He looked at Richard carefully. "And I kept wondering what she'd say if she saw me sitting here hating you." Richard didn't respond. Walter wiped his eyes. "She'd probably tell me pain doesn't give you permission to become cruel." The courtroom sat completely silent. Walter reached into his pocket, then placed a small photograph on the table. Judge Judy looked at it. A faded picture of Clara smiling beside the old pickup truck. Walter smiled weakly. She loved that ugly thing. Even Judge Judy smiled a little. Then Walter looked at Richard one last time. "You can keep your money." Everyone looked stunned. Judge Judy blinked. "What?" Walter nodded slowly. "I don't want damages anymore." Richard looked shocked, but Walter wasn't finished. "I want one thing." Judge Judy leaned forward. "What?" Walter pointed directly at Richard Vane. "Look at me." Silence. Richard hesitated. Walter's voice cracked slightly. "Not at the lawsuit. Not at the inconvenience. Not at the homeless veteran." Walter stepped closer. "Look at me like I matter." For the first time in the entire hearing, Richard Vane truly looked at him. Not through him, at him, and something shifted, tiny, but visible. Walter continued quietly. "My wife used to say people die twice." Judge Judy listened carefully. "The first time is when their body goes." Walter swallowed hard. "The second time is when nobody sees them anymore." Even the bailiff looked emotional now. Walter pointed toward the courtroom doors. "There are thousands of people outside these walls. Everybody stopped seeing." Richard lowered his eyes. Walter sat back down slowly, and for nearly 10 seconds, nobody spoke. Then Judge Judy finally delivered her ruling. Her voice was calm, measured, but devastating. "Mr. Vane, your company wrongfully towed and destroyed this man's vehicle without reasonable due diligence." Richard stared at the table silently. "You failed to inventory the contents," she continued. "You ignored multiple indicators that the owner was in distress." Another pause. "And perhaps most disgracefully, you treated a human being like discarded trash." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Judge Judy signed the paperwork. "I'm awarding the plaintiff the full $11,000 requested." Walter nodded quietly, but Judge Judy wasn't done. She looked toward Richard directly. "And I hope this costs you far more than money." Silence. Then she looked at Emily. "Young lady?" Emily looked up. "Your mother would be proud of you for speaking today." Emily broke down, crying again. Judge Judy gathered her papers. But before ending the case, she did something nobody expected. She reached into her own purse, pulled out a business card, and handed it to Walter Brooks. "This is a veterans housing coordinator I personally trust." Walter stared at the card in disbelief. Judge Judy's voice softened slightly. "Call him today." Walter looked unable to speak. Judge Judy nodded once. "And Mr. Brooks?" "Yes, Mom?" "You mattered long before this courtroom noticed." Walter's lips trembled. The courtroom stood in complete silence as he slowly saluted her. And for the first time all day, Judge Judy saluted back.